It took me years to understand this. And honestly, it's still hard to accept. Most people don't lose their autonomy inside the hospital. They arrive here, already without it. At the beginning of my career, I truly believed the hospital was where everything started, where things went wrong, where life suddenly changed direction. But after so many shifts, so many faces, so many stories ending the same way with only slight differences, I started to realize something unsettling. The hospital isn't where things begin. It's just where the consequences become visible. My name is Renata. I've been a nurse for 11 years. And during that time, I've learned to notice things that don't show up in medical charts or test results. I've learned to notice silence. I pay attention to the way a patient answers simple questions, like whether they want water or if they're cold, because there's a moment, almost invisible, when a person stops deciding for themselves. And that moment rarely happens here. I've seen patients arrive fully conscious, mentally present, but unable to answer basic questions without first looking at a family member, as if they needed permission to exist. And no one sees that as a problem. In fact, it's often seen as care, as love, as protection. But over time I started seeing it differently. I began to recognize a pattern that repeated itself almost perfectly. It didn't matter the age, the illness, the financial situation. There was always a point before. A quiet moment, where that person slowly began giving up pieces of their own life. Sometimes it was something small, letting someone else handle everything, stopping making simple decisions, avoiding conflict just to keep the peace, adjusting so much to other people's needs, that without realizing it, they left their own behind. None of this feels serious when it's happening. Actually, it feels normal. But the problem is, it doesn't happen just once. It happens gradually. And when someone finally arrives here, lying in a hospital bed, fragile, dependent, what looks like something caused by illness, has often been building for a long time. I'm not talking about blame or conscious choices. I'm talking about something much more subtle, a kind of loss that makes no noise, that doesn't hurt at first. But by the time it shows up clearly, it has already taken much more than we can recover. Today, when a patient arrives, I still look at their charts, of course. But that's not what catches my attention first. I watch how they speak, how they hesitate, how they position themselves or don't. Because most of the time what happened to their body is just the final chapter of a story that started long before. And almost always, that story begins the same way, with small compromises that no one thinks are dangerous. I remember one patient, not because of her diagnosis or her chart. I remember her because of the way she looked at her daughter before answering anything. She arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was an ordinary day, the kind that doesn't stand out. The hallway was full, carts rolling by, quiet voices, monitors beeping in the background. Everything as usual. She came in a wheelchair, but she didn't look fragile at first glance. Her hair was neatly done, her clothes clean, a soft perfume you could notice when you got close. She looked like someone who had always taken care of herself. Her daughter was pushing the chair. She didn't seem tired. She didn't seem impatient. Quite the opposite. She was attentive, calm, answering everything before her mother even tried. And that's what caught my attention. When I approached and asked the patient her name, she opened her mouth to answer, but stopped, looked at her daughter, and the daughter answered for her. At that moment it didn't seem like much. It's common. It happens all the time. But over the years you learn that these small details say more than any test result. During triage I asked simple questions. She was in pain. If she had eaten. If she had slept well. And every single time, the same pattern was a glance, an answer that didn't come from her. The daughter was never rude. There was no impatience, no urgency. It was almost automatic, as if those roles had been defined a long time ago, as if that shift didn't start there. While I was checking her vital signs, I noticed the patient's hands. They were resting quietly on her lap. There was no tension, no resistance, but there was no initiative either. It was as if she was used to not needing to do anything. And over time that starts to show in the body. Not in a sudden way, but subtly, continuously. When we moved her to the bed, the daughter stayed close, organizing things, adjusting her bag, answering questions, anticipating needs. And the patient just followed everything with her eyes. There was no conflict, no argument, nothing that from the outside looked wrong. But when you see this every day, there's a very clear difference between care and replacement. And there, it was no longer just care. At one point, I asked the patient directly if she was comfortable. This time I waited. I didn't look at the daughter. I let the silence sit. She took a few seconds. It felt like she was searching for the answer. Or maybe for permission. Then, in a quiet, uncertain voice, she said, "I think so." It was the only answer that came from her without interference. And even then, it didn't sound certain. Sounded like doubt. In that moment I had a feeling I know very well. That this story didn't start there. Because when someone reaches a point where they're not even sure about their own comfort, they've usually given up much more than they realize. And the hardest part to see is that no one there seemed to notice. Not the daughter, not the patient, and most of the time, families don't realize when that line has been crossed. 'Cause there's no exact moment. No clear "this is when it happened." It happens gradually. So gradually, that by the time it becomes visible, it's already part of who that person has become. In the first few days, nothing seemed urgent. This is the kind of situation that doesn't stand out to an outside observer. There was no sudden decline, no critical event. The tests showed small, manageable changes. Clinically, everything looked under control. But over time, what starts to matter isn't what shows up in the results. It's what happens in between. I kept following that patient over the next few days. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that the problem wasn't what she had. It was what she had already stopped doing. The daughter remained present all the time, helping her eat, organizing schedules, answering doctors, deciding when her mother should rest, when she should sit up, when she should speak. And again, none of it seemed wrong. It was care. It was dedication. It was love. But there was a line, very subtle, that had already been crossed. Because little by little, the patient stopped trying. On the second day, when we brought her meal, I noticed she didn't even touch the utensils. She just waited. A few minutes later, the daughter arrived, sat beside her, and started feeding her. Without being asked. Without hesitation. As if that had already become normal. On the third day, I encouraged her to hold the cup. It was something simple. But she hesitated. Looked at her daughter. And before any movement could happen, the daughter was already there, holding the cup for her. I didn't interrupt. But it stayed with me. Because it wasn't about physical strength. It was about something that came before that. It was as if the body was simply following a decision that had been made long ago. A silent decision not to act. Not to choose. Not to assert herself. And that kind of decision doesn't happen all at once. It's built in small, everyday moments. When someone says, "Let me do it for you." When conflict is avoided. When opinions are held back because it feels easier. And little by little, what was once help becomes replacement. And what was replacement becomes dependency. On the fourth day, something stayed with me. I walked into the room, and the daughter wasn't there. It was the first time the patient had been alone since she arrived. The room was quiet. TV off. The tray untouched. She was staring out the window. I approached and asked if she wanted help eating. She paused. Didn't answer right away. She seemed uncomfortable. Not with the situation, but with the need to decide. Then she said, "I can wait." Not because she couldn't, but because she wasn't used to doing it alone. At that moment, it became clear to me that the difficulty wasn't physical. It was functional, emotional, built over time. Her body could still respond, but the initiative was gone. And this is something we see often. People who still could do things, but no longer do. Not because they truly can't, but because at some point someone started doing everything for them and never stopped. On the 5th day, the daughter said something to me, almost casually. "She's always been like this. She never liked making decisions." And that caught my attention. Because there's almost always a justification. An explanation that sounds simple. But when you look closer, reveals something deeper. No one is simply always like that. That is built too. Over the years. Through family dynamics. Through relationships. Through roles that are assumed without question. And when it reaches this point, it no longer feels strange. Feels natural. But the problem is, the body doesn't adapt to that without consequence. Because autonomy isn't just about big decisions. It's about small daily actions, small choices, small affirmations of existence. And when those are slowly taken away, the body feels it, the mind feels it, identity feels it. And when illness finally arrives, it doesn't find someone whole. It finds someone who, little by little, had already been shrinking. And that changes everything. Because what could have been faced, ends up being absorbed. Without resistance. Without reaction. Almost in silence. It was on the 6th day that something shifted. But not in her clinical condition. It changed in the way I began to see the story. Until then, everything seemed to revolve around the patient. Her body, her limitations, her responses. Or the lack of them. But that day I started paying attention to something else. Her daughter. Not what she was doing. That had been clear from the beginning. But why? She was still there, present, attentive, anticipating everything. Adjusting the pillow before her mother even noticed discomfort. Answering before the question was finished. Correcting small details like someone who already knew every reaction. She was efficient. She was devoted. But there was something, almost invisible, that started to stand out. She didn't wait. There was no space between a need and her action. And in that detail, something clicked for me. This wasn't just about caring. It was about not allowing her mother to need. Sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Because when someone no longer needs to try, they also stop being able to. And that's when I understood something that, to this day, repeats itself in so many stories I've witnessed. The problem never started with the illness. Or with age. And most of the time, not even with the person who lost their autonomy. It starts with something that, at first glance, looks positive. Someone who helps too much. Someone who avoids any discomfort. Someone who gradually takes over everything. And what looks like care begins, unintentionally, to erase the other person. Not suddenly, but slowly. So slowly that no one notices the exact moment the shift happens. And when they do, it's already done. That day I did something different. At a moment when the daughter stepped out briefly, I approached the patient again. No rush. No breaking the silence. And I asked something simple. If you could choose, what would you like to do right now? She stayed silent longer than before. Much longer. It didn't feel like she was choosing. It felt like she was trying to remember how to choose. Her eyes didn't look for her daughter this time. But they didn't find an answer either. After a few seconds she said, "I don't know." And that answer was more honest than any she had given so far. Because it wasn't about uncertainty in that moment. It was about something deeper. It was about having lost somewhere along the way her sense of self. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's when the story stopped being about one specific patient and became about a pattern I had seen many times, but had never named so clearly. I've seen children do this to their parents, husbands to their wives, wives to their husbands, and even people doing this to themselves. Avoiding decisions, avoiding discomfort, avoiding responsibility for their own lives. Always with good intentions. Always with reasonable justifications. But with the same outcome in the end. A person who, little by little, stops existing on their own. And when illness arrives, it doesn't meet resistance. It meets someone who had already been, for a long time, making space to be led. And that changes everything. Because it's not just the body that needs care. It's the ability to choose, to respond, to exist actively. And when that has already been lost beforehand, the hospital doesn't give it back. It only makes it visible. After that day, I kept taking care of that patient. But to be honest, the story was already clear to me. Not because I knew what would happen medically, but because I had seen that pattern many times before. And it almost always ends the same way. Not with a major event, not with a sudden change, but with a kind of silence. A silence that doesn't come from the room, but from the person. In the days that followed, the daughter remained present, caring, organizing, deciding, and the patient stayed there, following along. No resistance, no questioning, like someone who no longer expects to be included in her own choices. And this is far more common than people realize. Much more. Because most of the losses I see here don't start with illness. They start with small absences. The absence of opinion. The absence of confrontation. The absence of decision. Things that seem insignificant in everyday life. But over time, they accumulate. Until one day, the person no longer knows where care ends and where disappearance begins. And that's the hard part to accept. The truth most people avoid looking at. People don't lose their lives all at once. They give them up, little by little. In silent exchanges. In small concessions. In choices that seem harmless at the time. But repeated over the years, slowly reduce who they are. And when someone does everything for you all the time, may look like love. But depending on how it happens, it can also be the beginning of the end of your autonomy. Because autonomy doesn't disappear when it's taken. It disappears when it's no longer used. When it's no longer exercised. When someone, out of comfort, fear, or even affection, starts living in your place. And the most unsettling part is that this almost never happens with harmful intent. It happens with good intentions, with care, with love. But the outcome doesn't change. I've seen people who had every chance to respond. Simply not respond. Not because they couldn't, but because at some point in life they stopped believing they needed to. And that doesn't show up in tests. It doesn't have a clinical name. But you can see it in the eyes. In the hesitation. In the way someone waits. Even when they could still act. Today, when I see situations like this, I don't just think about the present. I think about the path that led there. 'Cause no one arrives at that point overnight. It's always a process. Slow. Almost invisible. But constant. And the hospital only reveals the final result. I'm not saying this as a nurse. Or as someone trying to give advice. I'm saying this as someone who has witnessed many endings. And has started to realize how similar they really are. In the end, it's not about illness. It's about everything that was set aside, long before it appeared. And maybe the hardest thing to realize is that this process doesn't begin when we lose strength. It begins when we stop using our own voice. Even when no one notices. Even when it feels easier. Even when it looks like care. Because in the end, what weighs the most isn't what we suddenly lose. It's everything we slowly gave away, without realizing.